What is it?
I'm not sure.
Was it a program?
This is not a song, this is a cry for help. It's too late for me. Go on and save yourself. They got the claws on me, I've never been the same. Now I can't feel a thing. I don't know who's to blame. And I don't care if you don't believe me, no, go on singing. I don't care if you don't believe me, no, go on singing. Life is but a dream. This is not a song, this is a suicide mission. Gonna crash into your house just to make you listen. Tuck behind your wall of defense mechanisms. And this is not a song, and this is not what I envision. And I don't care if you don't believe me, no, go on singing. I don't care if you don't believe me, no, go on singing. Life is but a dream. La da 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 da. La da da da.
So, I knew this storytelling lady for a few years, Mary Beth Washington. She passed away a little while ago in her 90s. When I met her, she was already a retired school teacher, but as she said, she had a part-time pension, but she lived full-time. I knew her for a few years, but I know hundreds, probably thousands of people had their lives completely transformed from knowing her for a few minutes. I saw it happen. It happened to me a bunch of times. Like once she dragged me to a memorial service and I don't even know if she knew the departed or not. The thing you have to know about Mary Beth is that she was the most peace-loving person. So if something was going on in a theater, in a house, on an alleyway, and there weren't guns drawn and there weren't fisticuffs, she was going to be there and she was going to bring along whoever she wanted. And that night, it was me. So when she said that we were going to a memorial service, I didn't really ask any questions. I just kind of followed her like the lambs in the nursery rhyme, just following Mary. We got to the church and the pastor was finishing up the opening portion of the service and he was offering up some prayers for the general welfare. And then it was time for people to rise and to share a touching memory that they had with this dear gentleman who had passed away. And so a man stood up and he was crying as he talked. And his words were just as eloquent as his tears. Went on for a few minutes and then he sat down. And as soon as he sat down, a woman stood up, also crying, also verbally eloquent. And then another person took their turn, and another, and two or three more, and three or four others. And then there was a pause. I don't know, 15 or 20 seconds. And it was broken by Mary Beth, who marched up from her place next to me up to the podium. There was a little incline in the floor. She marched up to the podium, and then, without any introduction or explanation, she belted out in this eerie tone that is still etched in my memory. And God stepped out on space, and he looked around, and he said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other. And God said, "That's good." Then God reached out and grabbed the light in his hands, and he rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun. And he set that sun ablaze in the heavens. And the light that was left after making the sun, he gathered it together in a shining ball, and he flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and stars. Then, between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world. And God said, "That's good." Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, and the moon was on his left, and the stars were clustered above his head, and the earth was beneath his feet. And God walked. And where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. And the lakes cuddled down to the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran to the sea. And God smiled again. And the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulder. Then God raised his arm and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land. And he said, "Bring forth!" And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forest and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, "That's good." Then God looked around, and he walked around, and he looked again on all that he had made. He looked at his sun. He looked at his moon. He looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things. And he said, "I'm lonely still." And so he sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. And by the bank of a river, he kneeled him down and put his head in his hands. And God thought and he thought until he thought, "I'll make me a man." And up from the bed of the river, he scooped the clay. And by the bank of the river, he kneeled him down. And there, the great God Almighty, who lit the sun in the sky and rounded the earth with the hollow of his hand and flung the stars to the far corner of the night, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. And then, into it, he blew the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And then Mary Beth just marched back down the floor, took her place back beside me, and there was another pause. But this one was filled with this strange and eerie quiet. Something I'd never really experienced ever before. And all I could think was, can you do that? In life, can you do that? Something that would take years to chew on, but I just had a couple of weeks because it was December and she took me to this holiday party. It was at somebody's apartment. And, they were singing and it was okay and they were saying their poetry. And then Mary Beth came up to the part of the carpet that we were using as the stage, and she unravels this scroll, like your 1200s proclamation of the king kind of scroll. And she unravels it. And she wasn't really looking very much at it, but we were all transfixed. And then she holds forth. Well, here we is, chillins, and here it is Christmas. Now, we all know we're here because it's Christmas, don't we? But what I want to know is, who gonna tell me how come it's Christmas? Because old Santa Claus come around about this time of the year, clown all the good children with presents. That ain't right, is it, Reverend? It's Christmas because the poor little Jesus was born on Christmas. Ain't it, Reverend? Well, both of them is mighty good answers. Old Santa Claus do happen around about this time of the year with the presents. And the poor little Jesus sure was born on Christmas Day. Now, the question is, did old Santa Claus start clawing children with presents before the poor little Jesus got born? Or did the little Jesus get born before old Santa Claus started getting around? I had that question growing up in a Jewish family, and here it was, the answer coming. And the kids argue about it, and who's got long whiskers, and so that must have come first. And then they argue some more about which comes first, the 4th of July or Christmas. They're halfway between each other. Till finally, the Reverend, like someone who has spent a lot of time with children and has patience with all different kinds of people, he finally lays it out and just lets us know what really happened. I couldn't wait. You see, one time it was a little baby born named the poor little Jesus. But didn't nobody know that was his name yet. They knew he was a powerful, smart, and powerful, pretty little baby, but they didn't know his name was the poor little Jesus. So, because he was so smart and so pretty, everybody thought he was going to grow up and be the king. So, quick as that news got spread around, everybody just about bust to get on the good side of the baby. Because they figure if they start soon enough, he'd grow up liking them and not chop their heads off. So old Moses went over and give him $100 in gold. And old Methuselah went over and give him a diamond ring. And old Peter give him a fine white silk robe. And everybody was running in with fine presents so the poor little Jesus wouldn't grow up and chop their heads off. Everybody but old Santa Claus. Old Santa Claus was kind of old and didn't get around much, and he didn't hear the news that the poor little Jesus was going to grow up and be the king. So, him and the old lady was sitting back by the fire one night, toasting the shines and talking about this and that, when old Miss Santa Claus up and remarked. She say, "Sandy, I hear Miss Mary got a brand new baby over at her house." "Is that a fact?" say Santa Claus. "Well, it's a mighty cold night to do anything like that, ain't it? But on the other hand, he'll be a heap of pleasure and fun for her next summer, I reckon." So the talk went on, and finally old Santa Claus remarked that it was powerful lonesome around the house, since all the children growed up and married off. "They all married well," say Miss Santa Claus. "And so I say good riddance. You ain't never had to get up and cure the colic and mend the clothes. So you getting lonesome. Me? I love 'em. But I'm glad they's married and doing well." So the talk went on like that for a while, and then old Santa Claus got up and got his hat. "I believe," he say, "I'll drop over and see how that baby's getting along. I ain't seen no chillin' in so long, I'm pure hungry to lean my eyes up agin a baby." "You ain't going out on a night like this, is you?" say Miss Santa Claus. "Sure I'm going out on a night like this," say Santa Claus. "I'm pure craving to see some chillins." "But it's snowing and going on," say Miss Santa Claus. "You know your physic been deviling you anyhow, and you'll get the Charlie Marbuses slopping around in this weather." "Don't mind the talk," say Santa Claus. "Get me my umbrella and my overshoes. And you better get me a little something to take along for a cradle gift too, I reckon." "You know it ain't nothing in this house for no cradle gift," say Miss Santa Claus. "Get something," say Santa Claus. You gotta give a new baby something, or else you got bad luck. Get me one of them big red apples out in the kitchen. What kind of cradle gift is an apple, say Miss Santa Claus? Don't you reckon that baby get all the apples he want? Get me the apple, say Santa Claus. It ain't much, one way you looks at it. But from the way that baby gonna look at the apple, it'll be a heap. So Santa Claus got the apple and he lit out. Well, when he got to Miss Mary's house, everybody was standing around giving the poor little Jesus presents. Fine presents, made out in gold and silver and diamonds and all like that. They had the presents stacked around that baby so high, you couldn't hardly see over them. So when everybody see old Santa Claus come in, they looked to see what he bring. And when they see he didn't bring nothing but a red apple, they all laughed. Quick as that boy grows up and gets to be the king, they told him, he's gonna chop your head off. No mind that, says Santa Claus. Y'all just stand back. And so he went up to the crib and he pushed away a handful of gold and silver and diamonds and stuff and handed the poor little Jesus that red apple. Here y'all, son, he said. Take this red apple. See how she shines? And the poor little Jesus reached up and grabbed that apple in both hands and laughed just as brash as you please. Then Santa Claus took and tickled him with his forefinger and say, and the poor little Jesus laughed some more and he reached up and grabbed a fistful of old Santa Claus's whiskers and him and old Santa Claus went round and round. So about that time, up stepped the Lord. Yeah. I swear, old Santa Claus, said the Lord, betwixt that apple and them whiskers, the little Jesus ain't had so much fun since he'd been born. So Santa Claus stepped back and bowed low and give the Lord howdy and said, I didn't know everybody was chivalrying or else I'd have stayed at home. I didn't have nothing much to bring this time. Because you see how it's been this year. The dry weather and the boll weevils got mighty nigh all the cotton. And that's all right, Sandy, said the Lord. Gold and silver have I a heap of. But verily, you sure do know how to handle yourself around the chillins. Well, Lord, say Santa Claus, I don't know much about chillins. Me and the old lady raised up 14, but she done most of the work. Me, I just likes them, and I manages to get along with them. You sure do get along with them good, said the Lord. It's easy to do what you likes to do, say Santa Claus. Well, said the Lord, there might be something in that too. But the trouble with my world is, it ain't enough people which likes to do the right thing. And you likes to do with chillins. And that's what I needs. So stand still and shut your eyes whilst I passes a miracle on you. So Santa Claus stood still and shut his eyes. And the Lord read back and passed the miracle on him and says, Old Santa Claus, live forever and make my chillins happy. So Santa Claus opened his eyes and said, thank you kindly, Lord, but do I gotta keep him happy all the time? That's a pretty big job and it'll be a heap of fun, but still, and at the same time, yeah, I know about chillins too, said the Lord. Chillins gotta fret and get in devilment every now and then and get a whooping from their ma or else their skin won't get loose so they can grow. But you just keep your eyes on them and make them all happy about once a year. How's that? That's fine, says Santa Claus. It'll be a heap of fun, too. What time of year you expect I make them happy, Lord? Christmas suit me, said the Lord, if it's all okay with you. That's just about fine for me, say old Santa Claus. So, ever since that day and time, old Santa Claus been clawing a chillin' on Christmas. And that's on the same day that the poor little Jesus got born.
Because that's the way the Lord runs things. Because the Lord knowed it wasn't going to be long before the poor little Jesus growed up and got to be a man. And when he done that, all the grown folks had him so as they could mourn their sins away and lay their burdens down on him and get happy in their hearts. The Lord made Jesus for the grown folks. But the Lord know the children's got to have some fun too. So that's how come it's Santa Claus and Christmas and all. And Mary Beth rolls up the scroll. And we're finishing picking up the hors d'oeuvres and the snacks we've left, and new people or met new interesting other people are getting each other's phone numbers, emails, or whatever, and we file out. And we were all just kind of dumbstruck. We kind of walked out of the apartment, kind of like, I don't know, the wise men looking for Jesus or something. And I know I walked home alone. I parted from the crowd as quickly as possible. I just couldn't get that story out of my head. I couldn't talk that way, but I feel like I had most of the plot. And so I did what any good artist, any good storyteller will do. I stole it. And for the rest of December and January, every group, any group of children, any family, anyone who looked like a receptive audience at all, I told them all about it. What really happened? What really happened? Well, I just couldn't get enough of it for 2 or 3 months, and then it kind of wore off. And I guess I'd have to say about the day it wore off. I was listening to this radio program, and they were talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, the book from the 1850s by Harriet Beecher Stowe, kind of helped feed the flames of the Civil War and the fight against slavery. And the guests, they were talking about how fewer and fewer people were reading that book since it first came out in the 1850s. They were getting it wrong. They were hearing that word, Uncle Tom, like a slur. You know, Uncle Tom is someone who kisses up to the man, the corporate bosses, the elected officials, the upper class, whoever. And who wants to have anything to do with that? And so high schoolers were closing the book shut before they even had a chance to open it, until these guys on the radio program footnoted the hell out of it. That's right. They explained it all. And so now every high school student that heard about or saw that book, they were going to get it. And they were going to read it, and they were going to take it all in, and Uncle Tom's Cabin was going to rise to the status that it deserved. Well, I'd heard of the book, but I hadn't been forced to read it in high school, and I hadn't found it otherwise. But that day, I went right to the place on earth you'd most likely expect to find a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I went to the downtown branch of the Berkeley Library, and I know how to find a book in the fiction section. You go by the author's last name, right? Well, so I was in the shelves, and I'm looking at Q, R, I don't know what I was expecting, like neon lights or like a big buzzer going off or something, but I thought it'd be pretty obvious. I was sure there was going to be 6 or 7 copies with big colorful jackets on it or something like that. I can't find it anywhere. I can't even see her name. But after just being really, really exasperated, I can be really persistent when I'm looking for a book that I know that I want. And so I get down there. S-T-O, still waiting for the neon signs or whatever. W, there's the help, stock it. Oh, I've got it. W-E, where's the book? There's just these plain covered old books, and they have names like Old Town Folks, The Minister's Wooing, Dread, D-R-E-D, I double checked that I'd spelled her name right. I thought I knew how to say it. Yeah, that was it. There were no other Stows there on the shelf, and so I was satisfied that it was her. And I don't know about you, but when I know that someone's famous for having written something great, what I love to do is find everything else first. So I gobbled up all of those books, some of them 2 or 3 times, especially The Minister's Wooing. That's now my favorite book in all the world. I think I've read it 6 times now. Anyway, I gobbled up all those books before eventually getting to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in addition to having surprising plots and all kinds of advantageous features, they all have some kind of twang in them. There's a lot of dialogue and a lot of dialect because the story is in Kentucky or it's in some part of New England where they talk kind of like they do in Kentucky. Or there are slaves who have run away from the South, who are in the South. It's just full of that twangy whatever that I just love so much, in addition to the other parts of the book. And so when I finished my, 6-month meal of all those books, I don't know if I did it on purpose or not, but I seem just to be finding every next book was something with that kind of sound in it. And then, I guess it was about 3 years later, maybe I was rereading a Stowe book. I'm not sure what it was, but I was reading a page that had a lot of talking back and forth in it. And you know how when you're reading something like an Irish brogue or the Gettysburg Address in Brooklynese, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth, and you have to mentally translate all the contractions into what the sentence literally means. I wasn't doing that. It was going direct. And as soon as I noticed that, I called up Mary Beth and I remembered that Christmas story. I said, what is that guy's name? Now I know that unless I told you or Mary Beth told you, you've never heard of Roark Bradford. Your friends haven't heard of Roark Bradford, even if they teach English up at Cal. Nobody knows who Roark Bradford is, but she said his name, and I thought, my God, where can I find this? Well, the crazy thing, now see, I don't know what possessed Mary Beth to just haul off up to the lectern like that. And I don't know where she originally found that poem, but when she would do stuff like that, in my reading life, I would just come across it somewhere, something that she had belted out or something that she had quoted. And I was walking down Martin Luther King here in Berkeley one day, and kind of like those Stowe books in the library, I this kind of fat but plain, simple, green-covered book, just with a simple title on it. And I open it up, and it's a book of Christmas stories. And I'm flipping through it, and there it is. How Come Christmas? And I showed it to Mary Beth, and she said, that's it. That's it. Oh, by the way, Mary Beth was black, and Roark Bradford, a white guy. That might matter a little while or not, but anyway, she said, that's it. She had come across this book when her kids were coming up in the 50s and 60s and found that story and told it to them over and over again and practiced it so well that she could, unravel a scroll and give it all to us. Well, from then on, there was nothing unconscious about it. I was looking for drawl everywhere I could find it. Certainly, Mr. Bradford must have written something else. Oh, he did. He wrote 2 whole books, one called Old Man Adam and His Chillins, filled with Bible stories. Another one, Old King David and the Philistine Boys. Yeah. Oh, he was stuffed with it. But he also wrote something set maybe a little bit like Miss Stowe, kind of set during the 1850s, just past slavery, Kingdom Coming. and some other books. Well, in my search to find every twang and drawl and eloquence that I could find, a good friend turned me on to Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote at the same time as Mr. Bradford. And she was an anthropologist. And, you know, she got dinged by critics of her work. Black people, white people, all different persuasions of literary taste. She got dinged for making people sound stupid. Now, you can go online and you can find, she was part of a recording project in the 1920s. A guy named Alan Lomax went around and in search of work songs, chain gang songs, things that from the singing tradition and the oral tradition that were fading out because people were dying out, and he wanted to get it on tape while he still could. Stories of people from slavery who were still alive. Well, Hurston was part of that project, and you can hear her on one of the tracks, and she's describing this work song, and it's a song that guys are singing while they're putting in train tracks. And she's describing how they have to change something about how they're hammering it, or they have to stop or start. I don't remember what it was really, but the main thing is that she's explaining that they change the song. The guys way down here have to change the song for the guys working over here so they know what to do next. And she gives it to you. She tells you exactly how they put the words together. I'm thinking, this woman maybe knows how people talk. Well, she's wrote a lot of different things. And one book that she's famous for, Their Eyes Were Watching God, worth all the hype. But unless you've read the book, you haven't heard this passage. Well, all right then. Since you own up you ain't smart enough to find out what I'm talking about, I'll tell you. What is it that keeps a man from getting burnt on a red-hot stove? Caution or nature? I'm going to tell you. I'm going to run this conversation from a gnathill to a lice. It's nature that keeps a man off a red-hot stove. Uh-huh. I know you were going to crawl up that holler, but I aims to smoke you right out. Tain't no nature at all. It's caution, Sam. Tain't no such thing. Nature tells you not to fool with no red-hot stove, and you don't do it neither. Listen, Sam, if it was nature, nobody wouldn't have to look out for babies touching stoves, would they? 'Cause they just naturally wouldn't touch it. But they sure will. So it's caution. No, it ain't. It's nature. 'Cause nature makes caution. It's the strongest thing that God ever made now. Fact is, it's the onlyest thing God ever made. He made nature, and nature made everything else. No, nature didn't either. A whole heap of things ain't ever been made up yet. Tell me something you know of that nature ain't made. She ain't made it so you can ride a butt-headed cow and hold on to the horns. Yeah, but that ain't your point. Yeah, it is too. No, it ain't neither. Well, what is my point? You ain't got none so far. Yeah, he is too, Walter cut in. the red hot stove is his point. Well, here we is, chillins, and here it is Christmas. Now, we all know he's here because it's Christmas, don't we? Uh-huh. I know you were going to crawl up that holler, but I aims to smoke you right out. You know, when I started really getting into Mr. Bradford and then Miss Hurston, I was just sharing them with whatever audience I could find. But I don't know, I started recording some, and maybe they were going to be on the radio at some point. I don't know what happened, but nobody seemed to care, whatever their, red, green color, whatever color of their skin, whatever their background, nobody seemed to mind. But then, at some certain point, people started to ask me, hey, you know about blackface, don't you? Well, yeah, that was like the minstrel shows, right? White people putting on black face paint, making black people look really, really stupid. So I started to get just kind of queasy about this twang, Instead of just calling out and asking people, hey, you got a minute for free theater? Before I did that, I would look around and see, are there kids in this group? What is the color of the skin of this group? I just really started to freak myself out. I kind of felt sort of dirty inside, but excited at the same time. And around about that time, a friend told me, if you're into that, you have got to check out the Uncle Remus stories. Uncle Remus, anybody? The composite character. Brer Rabbit, anybody? Brer Rabbit, Brer Fox, right? African-American folk tales. Slaves often told them in the fields, spread all over the country. But as far as I know, first time they were written down was by a guy, Joel Chandler Harris, who grew up on a plantation, and he grew up on a plantation hearing these stories. And he became a writer, and at a certain point in his career, he kind of feels the itch, he wants to get this stuff down on paper. Harris, a white guy. And so what he would do, the way he tells it, is he would just kind of inch his way around. This is the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And just in his goings about, he would kind of keep his eye out for black people who were shooting the breeze and spurting out something about Brer Rabbit this and Brer Fox that. And then he would chime in with some other story that he remembered, and he would listen to him jaw it out in this wonderful way, and he would scribble down notes. And finally he made a book out of it. And he added this guy, Uncle Remus, who's on a plantation, and he's telling the stories of Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, and he's telling them to this kid. Well, so I found there's a lot of different versions of these stories now, but I like to go to the source material of the source material. And I found this. Folks used to call them Craney Pros, honey. But now they ain't got no name but just plain Blue Crane. And I don't know whether there was such a big name. Oh, and if you can just help me out while we go through this, if you can just help me find the stupid. I'm looking for the stupid in here. And I don't know whether there was such a big name. They're just such start natural fools. There was one time, I don't know the day and I don't know the year, but was one time there come a big storm. The wind blowed a hurricane, and the rain rained like all the sky and the clouds in it done been turned to water. The wind blowed so hard, that it lifted old Craney Crow from his root in the lagoons way down yon where they live at, and fetch him up in these parts. And when he come a whirling. The wind took him up, it did, and turned him round and round. I don't know, I'm hearing Wizard of Oz. Anybody hear him? Any stupid yet? Okay. And when he lit where he did, he staggered, just like he was drunk. You know how you feel when you've been turning round and round? Well, that was the way with him. He was so drunk that he had to lean up against a tree. But it wasn't long before he gonna feel all right, and he looked around for to see where he at. He looked and he looked. Oh, another program note. This is 1880s, 1890s. Mr. Bradford, Miss Hurston, the 30s. I don't know what this sounds like to you, but it takes like 5 or 6 extra weeks to get down how to talk like this. It's not the same thing. Yet, it wasn't long before he gonna feel all right, and he looked around for to see where he at. He looked and he looked, but he ain't find out because he was a mighty far ways from home. Yet, he feel the water halfway up his legs. And if old Craney Crow is in a place where he can do a little wading, he kind of has the home feeling. You know how that is yourself. Well, there he was, a mighty far ways from home, and yet up to his knees in water. And he just stood there, he did, and took his ease, hoping for better times by and by. Now, the place where he was blowed to was Long Cane Swamp. And I wish I had time for to take you over there and show you right where he was at when he lived. And I wish I had time for to take you all through the swamp and let you see for yourself what kind of thing it is. It ain't only just a swamp. It's something worse than that. You can stand in the middle of it and almost hear it catch its breath. And that's a make I say it ain't no swamp for all it looked like one. By the way, there definitely is stupid in some books, but it's harder to get them out of the library. Penrod is one. But I'm still looking for the stupid here. Okay. Well, there was old Craney Crow, and there was the thing you call the swamp. And by the sun rise and let his lamp shine in there in places. And then old Craney Crow had time for to look around and see where he was at. But when he found out, he ain't know no more than what he know at first. Now, you can say what you please, and you can laugh if you want. But I'm gonna tell you that the swamp knowed that there was somebody there what ain't belong there. If you ask me how the swamp knowed, I'll shake my head and shut my eyes. And if you ask me how I knowed it knowed, I'll just laugh at you. You'll have to take my word or leave it. I don't care which. But there it was. The swamp knowed that somebody was there what ain't belong there. And it went to sleep and had bad dreams. Well, the swamp woke up. And old Craney Crow, like Dorothy, the whole caboodle was brand new to old Craney Crow. And he looked with all his eyes, and he listened with all his ears. There was some or another going on, but he can't make out what it was. He ain't never been in no swamp before, most especially a swamp what got life in it. He been used to marshy places, where there ain't nothing but water and high grasses. But there where he find himself after the hurricane, there wasn't no big side of water, and what grass there was wasn't longer than your finger. Instead of grass and water, there was vines and reeds and trees with moss on them that made them look like Grand Sir Graybeard. And the vines and creepers looked like they was reaching out for him. He walked about, he did, like the ground was hot. And when he walked, he looked like he was on stilts. His leg was so long. He humped round for a place to sleep. And whilst he was doing that, he took notice that there was something or another going on that he ever ain't seen the like of. the jack-o'-lanterns. They lit up and went sailing around like they was hunting for 'em. And the frogs, they holler at 'em with, "What you doing here? What you doing here?" Well, he moved about, he did, and after so long a time, they let him alone. And then, when there wasn't nobody or nothing pestering him, he gonna look around for himself. Peeping first in one bush, and then in another. He took notice that all the birds what fly by day had done got to bed without their heads. Look where he marked. Old Craney Crow ain't seen ne'er a bird, but what had done took his head off before he went to bed. Look close as he can, he ain't seen no bird with a head on. This make him wonder, and he asks himself, how come this? And the onlyest answer what he can think on is that they go with their heads. The only answer that he can think of is that they go with their heads on because they don't want to be out of the fashion. Now, you can say what you please about the creatures in their kin, about the fowls that fly and the feathery creatures that run on the ground. You can say what you please about them, but they got pride. They don't want to be out of the fashion. When it comes to that, they're pretty much like folks, and that's the way with old Craney Crow. He don't want to be out of the fashion. He's shamed for to go to bed like he always been doing, because he wanted the others for to laugh at him and say he was from the country district, where they don't mow much. Yet study as he might, he don't know which way to do for to get his head off. The others had their heads under their wing, but he didn't know that. He looked around, he did, for to see if there's someone he could ask about it. And he ain't had to look long either, for there, sitting right at him, was old Brer Popeye. And who was Brother Popeye? Nobody in all the round world but Brer Rabbit. He had one name for the upland and another name for the bottomland, the swamps and the dreams. Wheresoever there was any mischievousness going on, right there was Brer Rabbit, as big as life and twice as natural. He was so close to old Craney Crow that he had to jump when he see him. Old Brer Popeye say, "No needs for to be scared, friend Craney Crow. You may be more than sure that I'm a well-wisher." It do me good for to hear you say so, Mr. Popeye. And seeing that it's you and not someone else, I don't mind asking you how all the flying birds take their heads off when they go to bed. It sure stumps me. Ain't no wonder, friend Craney Crow, 'cause you're a stranger in these parts. There ain't nothing to hide about. The skeeters has been so bad in this swamp since you won. And during that time what's gone by, that them will live here and got in the habit of taking their heads off and putting them in a safe place. But how in the name of goodness does they do it, Brer Popeye? I know I'm feeling pretty smart about now. Mr. Popeye laughed to himself way down in his gizzard. He said, "They don't do it by themselves, 'cause that'll be asking too much. Oh no, they got someone hired for to do that kind of work." "And where can I find him, Brer Popeye?" "He'll be around directly. He always have to go around for to see that he ain't missed none of them." Craney Crow sort of studied, he did, and he allowed, "How does they get their heads back on, Brer Popeye?" "I tell you if I know, but I have to stay up so much at night that long about the time when they gets their head put on, I'm sound asleep and snoring right along. If you say so, I'll send up the doctor what does the business, and I expect he'll accommodate you. I can promise you that much, since you've been so polite. I done find out in my time that there ain't nothing that pay like politeness, especially if she's genuine. With that, Brer Popeye put out, he did, for to find Brer Wolf, knowing pretty well where he was. And it wasn't long, for here they come galloping back. Mr. Craney Crow, this is Mr. Dark Wolf, Mr. Dark Wolf, this is Mr. Craney Crow, glad for to make you acquainted. And after they've been acquainted, old Craney Crow tell Dark Wolf about his troubles and how he want to do like the rest of the flying creatures. And Dark Wolf rub his chin and put his thumb in his waistcoat pocket for all the world like a sure enough doctor. He say to old Craney Crow that he ain't so mighty certain and sure that he can help him much. He say that in all his born days, he ain't never seen no flying creature with such a long neck. And it'll have to be mighty in particular how he fool with it. He went close, he did, and feel it and fumble with it, and all the time his mouth was watering, just like you do when you see a piece of lemon pie. You'll have to hold your head lower, Mr. Craney Crow. And with that, he snapped down on it. And that was the last of that Craney Crow. He ain't never seen his home no more. And more than that, old Dark Wolf slung him across his back and cantered off home. And that's the reason that the Craney Crows all fly so fast when they come to this part of the country. You know, Southern accents just freak us out. They do. People who study this stuff, when they're talking to people who live in a place, when there's some kind of twang like Georgia or Louisiana or Florida, they say when they hear about somebody who talks that way that they're very, very friendly, friendlier than most, but also dumber. Yeah. And I get that. You know, I met this woman once who's just a model friend in a lot of ways. You know, would tell you what you need to hear, even if you don't want to hear it. A really thoughtful listener, well-read, critical in the best sense, just doesn't take any news item at face value. Whew. Man, she heard me say the name Uncle Remus. She just about went ballistic. She like left the table. Come to find out later, she'd never seen this stuff before. But, you know, there are other reactions. Like I said, I was getting kind of queasy and kind of looking out for myself, taking my little treasures around. And one time, I was with Rachel B. here in the audience tonight. We were sipping some lemonade at this cafe out by the Richmond Costco. And I had a bunch of books and a bunch of all this with me. And this group of senior-looking white people comes by where we're sitting. And I feel that itch, you know, I want to call out to them. But I don't. And they pass by, and I think to myself, oh man, should you have chickened out? And I turned to Rachel and I said, should I have chickened out? And no sooner do these people go on, it looks like they were going on their regular hike. No sooner do they pass by, somebody else comes. And I don't ask for a minute of free theater, but I ask, do you want to hear an Uncle Remus story? And this woman comes up and she sees the cover and she sits down, and I'm feeling a little nervous, but also anxious to share. And so she says, well, yeah. So I share with her about old Craney Crow, the whole thing, right? Which is more than what you know about. And I asked her, you know, how was that? How was that for you? And she liked it. She liked it a lot. And I asked her, you know, did it matter? Oh, she's a black woman. Did it matter to you know who was telling it to you? She said no. And then she launched into this thing. As far as I can tell, this book, from the time it came out in the 1880s, it was like the Bible. It was on every night table till around about 1962, from talking to people who were coming up in that time, doing a little research. And then it disappeared. Well, this woman was in, I think she said, third grade, along about 1962. And this Caucasian guy came to her third grade class and butchered one of those stories. Well, that, together with a good thing that was happening at the time, you know, there's ethnic studies classes and programs are making it into colleges and in the news, and people are being more critical about who wrote what about whom and who's saying what about whom and how are they saying it and who should be saying it. And so that's just kind of buzzing around in her family and in the socio-political whatever haze thing. And so she basically, if I had to summarize it, basically her feeling about the Uncle Remus stories, the Brer Rabbit, was kind of shh. But if I don't say so myself, until she heard this version of it, and she loved the story. She loved the story. So let's finish up this section just by letting you know that there's a guy who wrote about this same time, the 1880s, 1890s. And I found him first without looking for him. I was in this great bookstore. It's the perfect bookstore, actually, in downtown Oakland called Bibliomania. And some people have been there. You know, it has, not only does it have the perfect content, 100% high quality selection, but the books are all, while they're not antiques and they're not $1 million, they're like close to first editions and they're just beautiful. You'd want to have them around whether or not you read them or not. So I'm browsing in this store on the shelf. And I don't know what attracted me exactly. It was kind of a simple cover. I don't know what it was about the sign, but I pulled it out. And, you know, it's got these pictures in it. And it's got those apostrophes, you know, that means contractions. That means you get to talk like that. And there's this one. It goes like this. Oh, there's lots of care and trouble in this world to swallow down. And old Sorrow's pretty lively in her way of getting round. Yet there's times when I forget 'em, aches and pains and troubles all. And it's when I take it evening, my old banjo from the wall. About the time that night is falling, and my daily work is done, and above the shady hilltops, I can see the setting sun. When the quiet, restful shadows is beginning just to fall, then I take the little banjo from its place upon the wall. We're going to hit the cue, but we're going to go on a little further. Then my family gathers round me in the fading of the light as I strike the strings to try 'em, if they all is tuned aright. And it seems we're so nigh heaven, we can hear the angels sing when the music of that banjo sets my cabin all a ring. Just take a moment here. Folks used to call them cranny crows, honey. Then my family gathers round me in the fading of the light as I strike the strings to try 'em, if they all is tuned aright. And it seems we're so nigh heaven, we can hear the angels sing when the music of that banjo sets my cabin all a ring.
Act one.
I think even honest.
So the guy with the banjo on the wall, Paul Laurence Dunbar. And the funny thing is, on the opposite page in another book where that poem appears, sets my cabin all a ring. And then we got this. If you could sit beside me at the sea today and whisper with me sweetest drink. He also wrote this novel called The Uncalled. And it features this orphan kid. You first meet him when he's 5. And he talks in standard English throughout the whole book. And then everyone around him talks kind of like the banjo guy. He doesn't say anything about anybody's skin color, and sometimes not even where they're from. All you know is how people talk. And anyway, so I'm not here to knock standard English. I'm really not. And this week we're celebrating the birth of Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a specialist in civil disobedience, a specialist in recognizing unjust laws and refusing to cooperate with them. There's just sometimes when you don't have to do what you're asked for, what you're asked for. And he had a lot of influences in his manner of speaking as well as his convictions, right? In his manner of speaking, he has a lot of standard English, whatever that is, as well as some dialect. And his convictions were influenced, among other things, by Henry David Thoreau, the guy who brought us Walden, right? The book about him going off alone by the lake and the hill and whatnot. Well, he also wrote this essay, maybe you know this. He wrote an essay called Civil Disobedience, right? And there's a line in it. This is not it. There's a line in it that says, what do you have a conscience for if you're not going to use it? The thing is, the best description of what it's like to just not do something comes, in my humble opinion, not from that. As important as it is, as eloquent as it was, as influential as it was on people like Dr. King, really the best description of what it's like from all vantage points, from the one doing the refusing to the ones being refused upon, as well as the people watching, comes, of course, from fiction. Yeah. Herman Melville, anybody? The guy who brought us Moby Dick, the huge fat book about the whale and the crazy captain. He also wrote a short story that's kind of long, actually, called Bartleby the Scrivener. And he wrote this story about along about the time that Thoreau was writing about civil disobedience, about not cooperating. Melville was also writing about non-cooperation, but in a more striking fashion in this story. So this is the 1850s, right? So you can't, if you're in a law office like the narrator, you can't just haul off to Krishna copy and get everything done, right? All the testimony in all your court cases, it's got to be hand done. I'm a calligrapher. I kind of like knowing that. And anything, all of the forms that have to be filled out in triplicate, they like literally are done in triplicate. So if you're the lawyer, you got to hire tons of people to do all that for you. And so here's how one person handles that situation. The nature of my avocations for the last 30 years has brought me into more than ordinary contact with what would seem an interesting and somewhat singular set of men, of whom as yet nothing that I know of has ever been written. I mean the law copyists or scriveners. I've known very many of them, professionally and privately, and if I pleased, could relate diverse histories at which good-natured gentlemen might smile and sentimental souls might weep. But I waive the biographies of all other scriveners for a few passages in the life of Bartleby, who was a scrivener, the strangest I ever saw or heard of. While of other law copyists I might write the complete life, of Bartleby nothing of that sort can be done. I believe that no materials exist for a full and satisfactory biography of this man. It's an irreparable loss to literature. Bartleby was one of those beings of whom nothing is ascertainable except from the original sources, and in his case, those are very small. What my own astonished eyes saw of Bartleby, that is all I know of him. And you know, in my private fantasies, I gotta know that Dr. King knew this story and was influenced maybe just as much as that other guy. So Bartleby gets to working. At first, Bartleby did an extraordinary quantity of writing. As if long famishing for something to copy, he seemed to gorge himself on my documents. There was no pause for digestion. He ran a day and a night line, copying by sunlight and by candlelight. I should have been quite delighted with his application, had he been cheerfully industrious, but he wrote on, silently, palely, mechanically. Now and then, in the haste of business, it had been my habit to assist in comparing some brief document myself, calling Turkey or Nippers, the other guys in the office, for this purpose. One object I had in placing Bartleby so handy to me behind the screen, he was so industrious, he had him set up his little cubicle right next to him so he could just quick give him off the jobs that needed to be hurriedly done right away. One object I had in placing Bartleby so handy to me behind the screen was to avail myself of his services on such trivial occasions. It was on the third day, I think, of his being with me, and before any necessity had arisen for having his own writing examined, that, being much hurried to complete a small affair I had in hand, I abruptly called to Bartleby. Any parents? Any teachers? Any activists? Any employees? Okay. I abruptly called to Bartleby. In my haste and natural expectancy of instant compliance, I sat my head bent over the original on my desk, and putting my hand sideways and somewhat nervously extended with the copy, so that immediately upon emerging from his retreat, Bartleby might snatch it and proceed to business without the least delay. In this very attitude did I sit when I called to him, rapidly stating what it was that I wanted him to do, namely, to examine a small paper with me. Imagine my surprise, nay, my consternation, when, without moving from his privacy, Bartleby, in a singularly mild, firm voice, replied, "Wouldn't we all want to say it? I would prefer not to." I sat a while in perfect silence, rallying my stunned faculties. Immediately it occurred to me that my ears had deceived me, or Bartleby had entirely misunderstood my meaning. I repeated my request in the clearest tone I could assume, but in quite as clear a one came the previous reply. "I would prefer not to." "Prefer not to?" echoed I, rising in high excitement and crossing the room with a stride. "What do you mean? Are you moonstruck? I want you to help me to compare this sheet here. Take it!" And I thrust it towards him. "I would prefer not to," said he. I looked at him steadfastly. His face was leanly composed, his gray eye dimly calm. Not a wrinkle of agitation rippled him. Had there been the least uneasiness, anger, impatience, or impertinence in his manner, in other words, had there been anything inordinately human about him, doubtless I should have violently dismissed him from the premises. But, as it was, I should have as soon thought of turning my pale plaster of Paris bust of Cicero out of doors. I stood gazing at him a while, as he went on with his own writing, and then reseated myself at my desk. This is very strange, thought I. What had one best do? But my business hurried me. I concluded to forget the matter for the present. With any other man, I should have flown outright into a dreadful passion, scorned all further words, and thrust him ignominiously from my presence. But there was something about Bartleby that not only strangely disarmed me, but, in a wonderful manner, touched and disconcerted me. I began to reason with him. This is just what Dr. King hoped, right? That the evildoer, the policeman with the hoses, the bigots, they would see your suffering. They would see you saying that you preferred not to, and begin to reason with them. These are your own copies we're about to examine. It's labor-saving to you because one examination will answer for your 4 papers. It's common usage. Every copyist is bound to help examine his copy. Is it not so? Will you not speak? Answer. Everybody? I prefer not to, he replied in a flute-like tone. It seemed to me that while I'd been addressing him, he carefully revolved every statement that I made, fully comprehended the meaning, could not gainsay the irresistible conclusion, but at the same time, some paramount consideration prevailed with him to reply as he did. You are decided then not to comply with my request. I'm thinking of the guys at the Woolworth counter sitting where they're not supposed to sit. You are decided then not to comply with my request, a request made according to common usage and common sense. He briefly gave me to understand that on that point, my judgment was sound. Yes, his decision was irreversible. And then, not only does he show us what happened, Mr. Melville, thank you very much, he tells us, so that we recognize it in our own heart, we all do, exactly what that feels like. Nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance. If the individual so resisted be of a not inhumane temper, and the resisting one perfectly harmless in his passivity, then, in the better moods of the former, he will endeavor charitably to construe to his imagination what proves impossible to be solved by his judgment. I don't know why the heck you're doing this, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But this mood was not invariable with me. The passiveness of Bartleby sometimes irritated me. I felt strangely goaded on to encounter him in new opposition, to elicit some angry spark from him answerable to my own. But indeed, I might as well have essayed to strike fire with my knuckles against a bit of Windsor soap. But, yeah, I don't get that either, but it's fine. But one afternoon, the evil impulse in me mastered me, and the following little scene ensued. Bartleby, said I, when those papers are all copied, I will compare them with you. I would prefer not to. How? Certainly you do not mean to persist in that mullish vagary. No answer. I threw open the folding doors nearby, and turning upon Turkey and Nippers, exclaimed, Bartleby a second time says he won't examine his papers. What do you think of it? Yeah, I'm not crazy, right? I'm just asking him to do his job. Bartleby, said I. Ginger Nut is away. Just step around to the post office, won't you? And see if there's anything for me. I staggered at my desk and sat there in a deep study. My blind inveteracy returned. Was there any other thing which I could procure myself to be ignominiously repulsed by? This lean, penniless wight, my hired clerk. What added thing is there, perfectly reasonable, that he will be sure to refuse to do? Like a very ghost, agreeable to the laws of magical invocation, at the third summons, he appeared at the entrance of his hermitage. Go to the next room and tell Nippers to come to me.
I would prefer not to.
He respectfully and slowly said, and mildly disappeared. And then, finally, after lots of speculating, lots of, oh, you can imagine. The narrator asks him, will you tell me anything about yourself?
I would prefer not to.
But what reasonable objection can you have to speak to me? Please clean your room. I feel friendly towards you. He did not look at me while I spoke, but kept his glance fixed on my bust of Cicero, which, as I then sat, was directly behind me, some 6 inches above my head. What is your answer, Bartleby? Said I, after waiting a considerable time for a reply, during which his countenance remained immovable. Only there was the faintest conceivable tremor of the white attenuated mouth. At present, I prefer to give no answer, he said, and retired to his hermitage. At last, familiarity drawing by my chair behind his screen, I sat down and said, "Bartleby, never mind then about revealing your history, but let me entreat you as a friend to comply as far as may be with the usages of this office. Say now you will help to work on these copies the next day." "At present, I would prefer not to be a little reasonable," was his mildly cadaverous reply. And then finally, "I've given up copying," he answered, and slid aside. He remained as ever a fixture in my chamber. Nay, if that were possible, he became still more of a fixture than before. What was to be done? He would do nothing in the office. Why should he stay there? In plain fact, he had now become a millstone to me, not only useless as a necklace, but afflictive to bear. Yet, I was sorry for him. I speak less than truth when I say that on his own account, he occasioned me uneasiness. If he would but have named a single relative or friend, I would instantly have written and urged their taking the poor fellow away to some convenient retreat. But he seemed alone, absolutely alone in the universe. A bit of wreck in the mid-Atlantic. At length, necessities connected with my business tyrannized over all other considerations. Decently as I could, I told Bartleby that in 6 days' time, he must unconditionally leave the office. I warned him to take measures in the interval for procuring some other abode. I offered to assist him in this endeavor, if he himself would take the first step towards a removal. "And when you finally quit me, Bartleby," added I shall see that you go not entirely away unprovided. 6 days from this hour, remember." At the expiration of that period, I peeped behind the screen, and lo, Bartleby was there. "Bartleby," said I, entering the office with a quietly severe expression, "I'm seriously displeased. I am pained, Bartleby. I had thought better of you. I had imagined you of such a gentlemanly organization that in any delicate dilemma a slight hint would suffice. In short, an assumption, but it appears I am deceived. Why," I added, unaffectingly starting, "you have not even touched that money yet," pointing to it, just where I had left it in the evening previous. He answered nothing. "Will you or will you not quit me?" I now demanded, in a sudden passion advancing close to him. "I would prefer not to quit you," he replied, gently emphasizing the not. "What earthly right have you to stay here? Do you pay any rent? Do you pay my taxes? Or is this property yours?" He answered nothing. "Are you ready to go on and write now? Are your eyes recovered? Could you copy a small paper for me this morning, or help examine a few lines, or step round to the post office? In a word, will you do anything at all to give a coloring to your refusal to depart the premises?" He silently retired into his hermitage. But when this old atom of resentment rose in me and tempted me concerning Bartleby, I grappled him and threw him. How? Why, simply by recalling the divine injunction, "A new commandment give I unto you, that ye love one another." Yes, this it was that saved me. Aside from higher considerations, charity often operates as a vastly wise and prudent principle, a great safeguard to its possessor. Men have committed murder for jealousy's sake, and anger's sake, and hatred's sake, and selfishness' sake, and spiritual pride's sake. But no man that ever I heard of ever committed a diabolical murder for sweet charity's sake. Mere self-interest, then, if no better motive can be enlisted, should especially, with high-tempered men, prompt all beings to charity and philanthropy. At any rate, upon the occasion in question, I strove to drown my exasperating feelings towards the scrivener by benevolently constructing his conduct. I believe that this wise and blessed frame of mind would have continued with me, had it not been for the unsolicited and uncharitable remarks obtruded upon me by my professional friends who visited the rooms. But thus it often is, that the constant friction of illiberal minds wears out, at last, the best resolves of the more generous. I'll just tell you, here's another piece with somebody who's spare of words. Most times, me and Mr. Leroy don't say much whilst we work. And we're mixing. Most times, me and Mr. Leroy don't say much whilst we work. Not only because it's hard to talk to someone that's knocking away at trees and swinging a heavy axe, but also because Mr. Leroy don't seem partial to running his mouth, nohow. To my way of thinking, that meant us walking home together was a good time to get a whole lot of the conversating done that we've been missing out on. Most every other night I gotta walk home by myself, and I ain't complaining. But sometimes it does seem like the walking would be a lot easier if I had someone to do it with. It ain't no sign of being a fragile boy, but if you have to walk home on a night when the moon's got blacked out, you just might get surprised and find yourself jumping at noises coming from the side of the road or from out the woods and then running all the way home screaming. Anybody that has some sense would be a little feared that one of those bears or snakes or wolves might have wandered out of the regular area and come over here. So maybe twixt the being real tired from all my work and the being real happy about having some company, my mind didn't have no chance at being right that night when the moon was covered and Mr. Leroy and me walked home together. This, by the way, is written in the 1990s, but set in the 1850s. Since he wasn't much of a talker, I figured he had plenty of practice on being a listener. And I was jawing at him pretty regular and fast. Even though it happened 2 whole days ago, I was still mighty worked up about Mr. Travis near snatching Kuda's ear off and not teaching us about family breeding contests. So after I talked for a while about fishing and animals in the woods and Ma Scratch's sweaters and how many first place ribbons Champion and Jingle Boy got at the fair, I started in on what happened when I got all those lines forced at me. Whilst we were walking for the first mile or so, Mr. Leroy would grunt and nod his head every once in a while, like he was paying some mind to what I was saying. But by the time I started in on talking about Mr. Travis, we'd covered us 2 miles easy, and Mr. Leroy wasn't showing no kind of interest in nothing I was having to say. He just tromped on ahead, looking like he was wishing I'd be quiet. But like I already owned up to, lots of things were coming together to make me want to talk and not pay too much mind to who it was I was talking to. And Mr. Travis went berserk, and before you can blink, he jumped clean across the room. I can't say how he did it, but it must have been flying, because to get it, Kuda Bixby had to go over 3 rows of children, and didn't one of them desks get knocked aside nor toppled over, nor did one of them children have no footprints on them, nor bruises from where he must have stepped. I could tell Mr. Leroy didn't particularly want to hear all this. He didn't tell me to be still, but he did pick the pace of his walking like he was rushing to get home. I wasn't about to miss the chance to get this off my chest, So I started halfway running and halfway walking to keep up with him. So Mr. Travis has got Cooter's ear wound up so tight that it's starting to look like somebody's finger instead of somebody's ear. And it's about the most awful thing you've ever seen in all your... And then I said them. I said those words that it made it so the lesson about familiarity and contempt will be fixed in my mind for as long as I live, even if that's to 50. I said, and me and all them other little nig... I knowed better. Ma and Pa didn't tolerate no one saying that word round them. They say it's a sign of hatred when a white person says it, and a sign of bad upbringing and ignorance when one of our own calls it out. So they ain't no good excuses. I knowed better. I didn't think Mr. Leroy was paying me no mind. I didn't even get the chance to get the whole word out. I never even saw it coming. It felt like whatever rope it was that was holding up the moon gave out all of a sudden, and the moon slipped free and busted through the clouds and came crashing down to earth before it exploded, square on top of me. All I saw at first was a bright light, which I figured was Mr. Leroy backhanding me across my mouth. Then I felt my senses flying away, which must have been me falling toward the ground. Then I felt like I'd been chunked by the moon, which would have been me knocking my head against the ground. I don't think it was for more than a second, but when I came to, I wished I'd been out for a whole lot longer, because Mr. Leroy was standing over the top of me with his hand drawn back, fixing to crack me all over again. He made up for all the not talking he'd been doing whilst we walked. Now he commenced jawing at me just as hard as I've been jawing at him. Is you out of your mind? I was about to say no, sir, but I figured this is one of them questions people ask just for the sake of asking it. They don't really want no answer. I probably couldn't have said nothing no way. My tongue was too busy roaming around my mouth, checking to see if any of my teeth had got set loose by Mr. Leroy's slap. What you think they called me whilst they were doing this? He opened the front of his shirt and showed me where a big square with the letter T in the middle of it was branded into him. The scar was raised up and shiny and was real plain to see, even if there wasn't no moonlight at all. What you think they call me? Mr. Leroy was screaming like it was him that lost his mind. What you think they call my girl when they sold her? What kind of baby they call her from up on the block? Mr. Leroy was spitting and looking mad as a hatter. I sure was glad he'd gone and dropped his axe when he first busted me across the mouth. Mr. Leroy, sir, what name you think they call my wife when they take it to another man for his own? What? I'm sorry, sir. How you gonna call them children in that school and yourself that name them white folks down home calls us? Has you lost your natural mind? You wants to be like one of them? You wants to be keeping their hate alive? I saw that Mr. Leroy really was out of his mind. He must have thought I was a white person that said that word. Mr. Leroy, sir, please, I ain't white. Please don't hit me no more. He raised his left hand, and I closed my eyes and tried to mash myself down into the dirt. White person? You think this here's about some white person? Look at this. Look. I opened my eyes and saw he wanted to slap me again. He was showing me where his littlest finger on his left hand used to be. He was pointing at all that was left there, a little stump. Who you think it was that cut my finger off? Who? I didn't know if I should answer him or just keep quiet and let him have his say. A slave, that's who. And the whole time he's slashing and stabbing at me, trying to cut my throat, what name he calling me? What name? I know, sir, but I ain't gonna say it no more. You think just because that word come twixt your black lips it means anything different? You think it ain't choke up with the same kind of hate and disrespect it has when they say it? You can't see it be even worse when you call it out? Sir, I only said it because I hear lots of children. What difference it make who you hear say it? I can understand a little if one of y'all freeborns use it. Y'all's ignorant in a whole slew of ways. Y'all ain't been told your whole life that's what you is. But someone who was a slave, or someone whose ma and pa was a slave and raised them good like y'all done, that just shows you believe in that what we be. That just shows you done swallowed that poison and swallowed it whole. There wasn't going to be no more hitting. I could tell Mr. Leroy was calming down. He commenced rubbing on his left arm, then reached his hand down to help me up. Once I got up, I quick wiped away the tears that were trying to get in my eyes. It ain't being fragile, but don't nothing in the world make you want to bawl more than getting a good backhand slap when you ain't expecting it. Now belting you like that probably wasn't the right thing to do, Elijah. But I ain't sorry I done it. If my boy Ezekiel was to call someone out that name like that, I praise to God someone would bust him up too. Y'all young folks gotta understand that's a name what ain't never called with nothing but hate. That ain't nothing but a word them slavers done chained us with. And if God's just like I know he is, one day it gonna be buried right along with the last one of them. That ain't one of the things we need to be carrying to Canada with us. Now, if you and me's gonna do any more working together, you know what you gotta say. I'm sorry, Mr. Leroy. I ain't never gonna use that word again. You got to always keep in mind, Elijah, that I'm grown and you ain't. You got to always remember that we gets along just fine, but I ain't your friend. I cares about you like you's my own boy, but you always got to give me my respect. You saying that word ain't showing no respect for me. It ain't showing no respect for your folks. It ain't showing no respect for yourself. And it ain't showing no respect for no one who's had that word spit on them whilst they're getting beat on like an animal. Elijah, it's my hope that there ain't no hard feeling twixt you and me. I likes the way you owned up to what you done. No, sir, ain't no hard feelings at all. Some of the time when a grown person asks you a question, you're smart to tell them what it is they want to hear, but that wasn't what I was doing. I said there weren't no hard feelings because I meant it. Paul's always telling me that people that used to be slaves are toting things around with them that can't be seen with your regular eyes. He says once someone was a slave, there's always going to be something in them that knows parts about life that freeborn folks can't ever know. Mostly horrific parts. He tells me that's why I got to be sharp on my guard when I'm talking with anyone that got free. They've seen people acting in ways that can't help but leave scars and peculiarities. Things that I might not think mean nothing, but things that can cut them to the quick. So I wasn't doing nothing but telling Mr. Leroy the truth when I told him I wasn't holding no grudges and that I wasn't going to use that word again. Good, son, because I really want you to know what I'm trying to say. And sometimes I ain't too good with my words. I know what you're trying to say, Mr. Leroy. It boils down to familiarity breeds contempt. Mr. Leroy picked up his axe and swung it across his left shoulder, then put his right hand on my head. I'll always remember Mr. Leroy hand on my head and the words he told me. I'll always remember that night when there weren't no moon and me and Mr. Leroy walked home together.
Thank you.
You know, you just can't pin Hurston down. You just really can't. I read this really long, it's like a 20-page New Yorker article all about her life and criticism of her work. And included in that was that, you know, about how she was making people look stupid. And I used to say, when I was just first getting all excited about all this twangy talk, I would take up Hurston and then take up Bradford from the Christmas Story or something and say, well, I dare you. I dare anybody to take hours looking at both of them. And if they didn't know, tell me who was saying what and who was writing what. But I spent a couple of months recently just rereading some books of hers that I had read already and reading new ones and looking at Bradford with new eyes. And it just got to me, you know, it's just not that simple. We're not that simple. Not in our lives and not in our sentences either. Of course you could tell. Of course you could tell. You might also be able to tell that that's maybe how somebody talked in the 1930s or the 1880s. But, you know, why should you know exactly who it is? And I'm reading some of the stories and I'm also thinking, you know, hey, these people do sound kind of stupid. But then I'm also thinking of the criticism that, you know, she doesn't put anything in any racial context. Nobody has any skin color. Nobody's being ordered around by this group or that group. And I didn't really quite see that either. There's this story that she wrote, and I came across it right about the time that Michael Brown was shot by a police officer in St. Louis. And I just felt like I'd been in the news or in the court that week. And it's called The Conscience of the Court. The clerk of the court took a good look at the tall, brown-skinned woman with a head rag on. She sat on the third bench back with a husky officer beside her. The people versus Law Lee Kimball. The policeman nudged the woman to get to her feet and led her up to the broad rail. She stood there, looking straight ahead. The hostility in the room reached her, without her seeking to find it. Unpleasant things were ahead of Law Lee Kimball, but she was ready for this moment. It might be the electric chair, or the rest of her life in some big lonesome jailhouse, or even torn to pieces by a mob. But she had passed 3 long weeks in jail. She had come to the place where she could turn her face to the wall and feel neither fear nor anguish. So this here so-called trial was nothing to her but a form and a fashion and an outside show to the world. She could stand apart and looked on calmly. She stood erect and looked up at the judge. And as we go through the next bit, maybe we can think about something I've been wondering. You know, it matters. It matters what people look like on the screen and in a book, and it matters who's deciding. But what if, you know, we're doing a better job, I would say. Maybe you would too. Like, for instance, how we depict women, right? Every woman on the screen and in a story is not some demure housekeeper who does everything that a man says. But what if in 2018, and you're writing about your mother, or you're writing some fiction that's really strongly influenced by your mother, and your mother was like that? She stood erect and looked up at the judge. Charged with felonious and aggravated assault, mayhem, premeditated attempted murder on the person of one Clement Beasley, obscene and abusive language. Law Lee Kimball, how do you plead? Law Lee was so fascinated by the long-named things that they were accusing her of that she stood there, tasting over the words. Lordy me, she mused inside herself. Looked like I'd done every crime except in habeas corpus and stealing a mule. Answer the clerk. The officer nudged Law Lee. Tell him, how do you plead? Plead? Don't reckon I make out just what y'all mean by that. She looked from face to face and at last up at the judge with bewilderment in her eyes. She found him looking her over studiously. The judge understood that look in her face, but he did not interfere so promptly as he ordinarily would have. Perhaps you don't understand what the clerk means, Laura, the judge found himself saying to her in a gentle voice. He wants you to say whether you're guilty of the charges or not. Oh, I didn't know. I didn't even know if he was talking to me or not. Much obliged to you, sir. Laura Lee sent his honor a shy smile. Indeed, I didn't even know if I'm guilty or not. I hit the man after he hit me, to be sure, Mr. Judge. But if I'm guilty, I don't know for sure. All them big words and all. All right, Laura Lee. You can take your seat now until you're called on. There was a pause during which Laura Lee covered a lot of ground. Then she smiled faintly at the judge and answered him. No, sir, I thank you, Mr. Judge. Not to turn you no short answer, but I don't reckon it would do me a bit of good. I'm mighty much obliged to you, just the same. Rapidly now, witnesses took the stand, and their testimony was all damaging to Laura Lee. The doctor who told how terribly Clement Beasley had been hurt, left arm broken above the elbow, compound fracture of the forearm, 2 ribs cracked, concussion of the brain, and various internal injuries. 2 neighbors who had heard the commotion and arrived before the house in time to see Laura Lee fling the plaintiff over the gate in the street. The 6 arresting officers all got up and had their say, and it was very bad for Laura Lee. Clement Beasley was borne from his cot to the witness stand, and he made things look 100 times blacker. His story was that he had come in conflict with this defendant by loaning a sizable sum of money to her employer. The money was to be repaid at his office. When the date was long past due, he had gone to the house near the river, just off Riverside Drive, to inquire why Mrs. Claiborne had not paid him, nor even come to see him and explain. Imagine his shock when he wormed it out of the defendant that Mrs. Claiborne had left Jacksonville. Further, he detected evidence that the defendant was packing up the things in the house. The loan had been made $600 on the furnishing of the entire house. He had doubted that the furnishings were worth enough for the amount loaned, but he had wanted to be generous to a widow lady. Seeing the defendant packing away the silver, he was naturally alarmed, and the next morning went to the house with a moving van to seize the furniture and protect the loan. The defendant, surprised, attacked him as soon as he appeared in the front door, injured him as he was, and would have killed him if help had not arrived in time. Laura Lee was no longer a spectator at her own trial. Now she was in a flaming rage. Plead? Don't reckon I make out what y'all mean by that. She was no longer a spectator at her own trial. Now she was in a flaming rage. You can find out the rest of it. You know, I was listening to this podcast a while back. It's mentioned in the program. They had an episode called The Song. And it was about the song Dixie. You know it. Dun, 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 dun. A Confederate anthem, right? Slave owners all loved it. And on the podcast, it's co-hosted by a white guy and a black guy, and they're looking into the history of the song. And they find out that it was written by a white guy in the North, and then picked up by another songwriter in the South, and it becomes a nationwide hit. And from nationwide hit, it gets picked up from leaders of the Confederacy, and they make it their song. And it's everywhere. It's in military marches, it's on plantations, it's everywhere. It's the sign of the South, it's the sign of slavery. It's a sign of a lot of things we think of as really bad right now. And But then they also find out Mr. Emmett, I think his name is, the northern guy who wrote it. He had a story that, he was out just sunbathing or something, and it came to him on a winter's evening. But there's some researchy type evidence, as well as an oral tradition from certain families, that this group of musicians who lived right next to this Emmett guy's grandparents, they were black musicians, taught him that song. They're called the Snowdens. I wonder if they're any relation. Taught him that song. And while you're hearing about this, the one of the co-hosts, the black guy, is talking about that song to him. Dixie is like the music version, the sonic version of the Confederate flag. It just turns him inside out. He just can't stand it. He just can't find anything in it to be in it. There's just no there. But he said, could we find maybe a musician of color who feels differently about it? And that might open my eyes in some way or another. And like in any good podcast, 10 seconds later, you hear the voice of a black musician, part of a banjo band. And what song do they play regularly? They play Dixie. They play it without comment for audience of all different types. And says the musician, I just wanted people to have their own reactions to it. Well, after a while of doing this, their own reactions to it, turned out to be hearing the N-word a lot. It really started to color his feeling about the music. Like his natural love of it was kind of eaten away at it by what happened to the audience and what the audience did about it. And so he quit the band and moved out into the country, living by himself in some quiet area, maybe where there's lots of craney crows. And he said one day his banjo just started calling to him. It was saying, play me. Play me. And so he started picking it up. And he said, I just realized, knowing everything I knew about that music, it sounds good. I like it. I like the sound of it. And it matters, the pictures that we see, the pictures that we make in our music and in our words. It really matters that we know who wrote what and who wrote about what and how they did it. But can we, or should we, just ever stop and say, that's good?
But be that as it may, in many faces I see anger that is hiding shame, or fear that covers just a hint that they might feel the same. Feel I'm being blamed, but you can always tell how much I mean well when the whole world turns away, when I don't know what to do, when the words are hard to say. I can talk to you. I can talk to you.